Well, okay, folks, this is it. This is the very last of our modules, the last professor's lecture, and so I hope that you've enjoyed the class thus far. This will be a little bit longer than typical because there's a lot to cover in this chapter, but I want you to know that this chapter may be the most important chapter of all because this is the one where you get the skills necessary to do formal crisis management. So we're going to talk about prevention. We're going to talk about assessment, we're going to talk about planning, and we're going to talk about intervention, and then finally, we'll talk about follow-up. Now, interventions will come in a wide variety of interventions, including people with loss, suicide, homicide, assault, and then various children's interventions. And so you are going to want to pay close attention because this will be the chapter, this will be the lecture that takes you to the next level. All right, you ready? Let's go. So crisis management is not therapy. It's either formal or informal. When crisis management is done by professionals, it's known as formal crisis management. When it's done by non-professionals or paraprofessionals, it's known as informal crisis management. Informal crisis management has been happening since the beginning of time. People have always been helping others through crises. It's only in recent years that we've begun to develop a set of strategies to train people in formal crisis management. We'll talk a little bit about those in the future, and I'll provide a few websites for you to begin an exploration. Look, there's going to be crises that happen, and the crises are going to continue to happen in our society, from little crises like families not having enough money to mid-level crises like I don't know, families in marital distress, all the way up to major crises like abuse, significant traumas like being robbed or being shot or being raped, all the way up to societal traumas like, policing strategies that target people of color. We have to constantly live in this kind of traumatic state, to hurricanes and natural disasters. We're going to see more of those caused by global warming, all the way up to societal crises like what happened when they stormed the Capitol on the 6th, right? And so both of these types of crisis management techniques or sets of techniques, either formal or informal, rely on the same strategies or the same techniques. So we want to think about this in a couple ways. Number one, we want to think about prevention. Prevention is what happens when somebody experiences stress or a family experiences stress, but before they go into crisis. That prevents a crisis. Whereas crisis management itself is what it sounds like, managing the crisis after it's occurred. Next slide, please. Now, as we talk about prevention, there's a couple ways of thinking about prevention. Anticipatory prevention, according to Hoff, from his 1989 thinking on this matter, or participatory prevention. Now, both of these types seek to kind of intervene before mental health becomes an issue, before the person really falls apart. So I've circled for you anticipatory prevention and participatory prevention on this diagram to show you the columns that we're going to be thinking about. Anticipatory prevention has beneath it primary prevention, things like family life education, psychoeducation. It thinks about what to do during suicide, the education to help the person from preventing suicide and getting to a level of distress that is, where they feel suicide is the only option. Homelessness, education on issues relating to homelessness, and then school suspension, educating about personal responsibilities, life goals, plans for achieving goals. Now, if you look to the right, you've got participatory prevention that breaks into two kind of pieces, secondary and tertiary. Tertiary, for those of you who don't know, means third. So primary first, secondary second, tertiary third. Secondary participatory prevention would be things like crisis intervention, and then tertiary prevention would be brief psychotherapy or even longer psychoanalysis, which can go on for really long times, including years, right? So If you look at these two pieces, you can begin to think about what prevention is all about, and we then will move a little bit deeper into these in the next few slides. Anticipatory prevention is reducing the likelihood of crisis and promoting growth and development and crisis resistance. So we don't want the person to proceed all the way to crisis. We want them to use the stressor to help them grow, develop, right? And then we want to build in to this individual or system crisis resistance so that in the future when crises occur or when stresses occur, they don't reach to the level of crisis. Now there's three forms of anticipatory primary prevention, and they are education, consultation, and intervention. And by these we mean education would be psychoeducation, helping the client or clients to understand their situation and what people can do to prevent crises from erupting. Consultation is like sitting with them and kind of learning from them and being their consultant as they struggle through the event. Then intervention would be some of the things we're going to talk about later, but actually doing what social workers do when we intervene in their lives to help them kind of develop, move forward, and then not proceed into crisis. Next slide, please. Participatory prevention can be either secondary or tertiary, depending on where and when the intervention occurs. Or by where, I mean when. I mean at what point in the cycle the intervention occurs. So let's delve into those a little bit more deeply. Participatory prevention, when we talk about it, is secondary prevention, right? It's crisis management. It is designed to shorten the crisis and to promote a positive outcome. So notice that anticipatory anticipates the crisis and tries to stop it. Participatory prevention, especially secondary prevention, the crisis has already happened, and so now we're trying to help the family manage the crisis, to shorten the crisis, and to assure that they emerge from the crisis better than they went into the crisis. Typically, this involves crisis management services. Now, the second category of participatory prevention is tertiary prevention, right? Third level. This happens when there are chronic stressors affecting the individual or family, such as mental illness, addictions, those kinds of things, because of negative outcomes of previous crises. So they've been through crisis before, and they've coped in ways that are less than sufficient, that have been disabling in a longer term. So tertiary prevention seeks to undo or repair the damage by unresolved past life crises. So this is why it's called tertiary. It takes the third place, right? Next slide. Now we want to move from prevention into crisis management skills. And so let's begin talking about crisis management skills. In order to assist somebody in managing a crisis, you must have a sense of helping skills in order to do no harm. One of the kind of the values of social work is that we don't want to further harm people. So we're going to talk about several skills that can be used to do some formal crisis management. There's a set of skills called attending skills, and those are things like listening, clarifying, reflecting, questioning, and summarizing, which we'll go into some detail on. And then rapport building. Now, rapport is when you establish a relationship with a client. You engage with the client. You, according to Salvador Minuchin in his structural family therapy, you join with the family. Temporarily, you become part of the family's world, right? You become almost like a surrogate member of the family for a time. So you join the system. This is when the individual or family has enough respect in your abilities and who you are to really believe that you can help them and to buy into the hope that you're purveying for them, you're giving to them, right? Because they are really struggling with hope in the midst of this stressor and crisis. Okay, so let's begin to explore in a little bit more depth each of these skills, starting with listening. Now, active listening is more than just hearing with your ears. Active listening is when you really engage all of your senses and use yourself, your body and your eyes and your ears to fully be there in the moment with the client. Some things that you might do would be leaning forward a little bit, making eye contact, nodding, maybe shaking your head from time to time, or little subtle gestures that say, I hear you, I care. The whole point of this is to help the client understand that you care, that you can see their world as they perceive it. So it's got elements of empathy, right? You're not just feeling sorry for them, but you're feeling what they're feeling. You're engaging with them at a deep level. This is the most, and probably most important, but the most basic of all the skills. If you can't listen, you can't do crisis management. Now, verbal attending skills include things like paraphrasing, kind of saying back, they've given you a long story and then you summarize it in a few sentences or a few words, right? Reflecting, wow, you sound hurt by that. Ooh, that sounds like it was painful. Wow, that's a major stress. Just kind of reflecting back to them what they're saying to you. You want to use a soft voice because if you start raising your voice or going too fast, then people get uncomfortable. So you want to keep your voice soft and empathetic, right? And then you want to track verbally what they're saying. So you'd want to say back a word or two of what they're saying. So they say to you, Hurricane Ida really wrecked my life, and you would say, wow, wrecked your life? Now that would allow them to say, yeah, well, what I mean is, and then they would say a few more words like, my whole house was ruined. That's a lot of ruin, right? So you would just kind of reflect back or track what they're saying to make sure that you're tracking with them. If you were to say, totally wrecked your house, they would say, well, okay, not totally, but, and so then you could continue to track with them, right? Those are some of the verbal attending skills, things we say, but there's some nonverbal attending skills as well. You want to make eye contact. You don't want to stare them down, right? But you want to make eye contact with them. You want to be careful about your body language. You want to use open gestures, which means, your palms are visible, and you might say from the, I care about you. So this would be, touching your heart and then kind of doing this, or touching your head, say, man, I understand, right? So you want to use your body to send messages. You want to lean forward slightly to your client. You want them to know that you are there for them, right? So leaning forward says, I'm engaged. And by the way, you want to face your client. You don't want to be, turned sideways to your client. That sends a whole different message. So you want to be facing your client, obviously leaning towards your client. And as much as possible, you want to have close physical proximity. You don't want to be sitting, in their lap, but you want to not be way across the room. You don't want to have a desk between you and them. So you want to come out from behind your desk so that you can be in the same space with them, right? That sends a message that I care for you. So let's look in the next few slides at how to do some of these things even better. Ready? Here we go. So clarifying. Clarifying is when you clarify what they've said. There's a couple ways of doing that. One is verifying questions. A verifying question kind of clears up some ambiguity, something that you don't completely understand. And it also verifies that you heard what they intended for you to hear. You might ask a question, and they answer with, well, okay, that's not really what I meant. What I mean is, and then you're tracking with them, right? If you don't ask a verifying question every now and then, a gentle question that's not accusatory, then the client doesn't really know that you care. Another clarifying skill is paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is a short summary of a long statement by the client. Now, when you sit with a client who's in crisis, they will talk for a long, long time about what's going on with them. And many times when I've been through like tornadoes, I did crisis management with a tornado in the Midwest one time, and people just want to talk about their experience. And so I would need to occasionally stop and paraphrase. Another time, a pastor that was the chaplain of a youth home had molested some of the kids. And so I had to go and sit with the faculty and with the students and with the parents and kind of talk through some of what had happened. And so I hear these long stories about how much pain they had and how angry they were, and I would need to break those down a little bit by paraphrasing what they said. Now, this encourages them sometimes to say more, right? It lets them know that you're trying to understand, that you're really hearing what they're saying, and you're trying to understand. It helps you focus on the specific problem, narrowing things down from the global down to the specific, what really is affecting them. So you do this by just highlighting parts of what they said, picking out the most important parts, and then repeating them back to the client so that they can either agree with you and move in that direction, or push back and say, no, you're not understanding what I'm saying, and move in another direction. Of course, you want to start with where the client is, and then build on what the client knows, and then use the skills that they already have whenever possible to help them cope. Or if they don't have the right skills, teach them a few new skills. But you can't do that until you fully understand what their inner world is like, right? And so you want to paraphrase in order to get deeper into that inner world. In other words, you're trying to understand what your client is thinking. Next slide, please. Now, reflecting skills are pretty much what they sound like. What is the point of a reflection? To help you see back what you look like, what you are like. So when we look in a mirror to comb our hair, or to shave, or put on makeup, whatever, we are seeing our reflection back. Well, reflecting skills then are our way of being a mirror to show them what they're going through, to help them understand what is going on in their life. Reflecting statements essentially rephrase what they're feeling, kind of reflecting back their emotions. It sounds like that was frightening. Wow. Overwhelming? You really were hurt by that. You're attempting to understand and to reflect back to the client what you hear them say about their emotions. And sometimes people don't have the words for their emotions. When we do this, we let the client know that we're feeling with them, that we understand their feelings. This is empathy, right? Defined. It reflects both the painful feelings, or the ambivalent negative emotions, but also the positive emotions. We want to recognize sometimes that they can't put their feelings into words, and so we see them crying, and we can say, so that would be a nonverbal emotional expression, right? We could say, I understand that you're hurting. Or they could ball up their fists and their face could turn red, and you could say, wow, looks like you're angry. So you can reflect both what they're saying and what they're telling you non-verbally. And you want to pay attention to both the negative emotions, the painful emotions, right, or the confused emotions, but also the positive emotions. You want to recognize that there's good in the midst of tragedy, and kind of build on those positive emotional strengths. In other words, reflection helps a client get in touch with what they're feeling. So we're helping them get in touch with what they're thinking. Now we're helping them get in touch with what they're feeling. So let's move on to the next set of skills, which are questioning skills. And these are tougher. Questioning skills. So you've got to gain some information. And you want to lead the client to a place where they can talk more deeply about themselves. So you have to ask questions. We've always been taught all our lives that questions are who, what, when, where, why, and how much. One of the things you probably want to avoid, especially early on, is starting a question with one of those words. In fact, of all of those question words, one of the words you probably want to avoid completely in most of your interviews with clients, and that's the word why. When you ask why, that can feel accusatory to a client. Like, why did you do that? And the client's like, well, wait, wouldn't anybody in a normal person in this situation do that? So you want to be careful not to ask why. In fact, you probably, as much as possible, especially in the early stages of an interview, want to ask what's called open-ended questions. They really don't begin with who, what, when, where, etc. They begin with tell me about, help me understand. I'm confused about, could you clarify? You're inviting them to tell you their story, right? Rather than asking them specifics. An open-ended question invites them into dialogue. And that gets you longer answers, right? With more detail. When you ask specific questions, which are closed-ended questions, typically starting with what, talks about the things, who, talks about the people, when, talks about the time, etc. How much, talks about quantity, etc. You will get a shorter answer. They will answer your specific question with a specific answer. So you want to, especially early on, ask open-ended questions. Tell me about, help me understand. So instead of saying, how did you cope with that? You might say, tell me about the ways that you coped with that. And instead of saying, why did you do that? You might say, ooh, help me understand what was going on in your head. Instead of saying, what was the experience you had? You might say, tell me about the experience you had. Tell me about what was going on inside of you. Tell me about what was going on around you. By the way, I wouldn't suggest using all three of those at once, because there's something called a double-barreled question, or even a triple-barreled question, where you say, you ask two questions at once, such as, what was going on with you? How were you feeling? Or, where were you at the time? And what were you thinking? So that's a double-barreled question, because you're asking two questions at once, and that can be confusing to a client. In other words, open-ended questions invite people into dialogue with you, while closed-ended questions elicit specific information. One gives you a long answer, open-ended. Closed-ended questions give you a short answer. Now, sometimes closed-ended questions are helpful when you need detail, but you want to be very careful to not ask too many closed-ended questions, because then the person will just answer your questions and it's going to feel like you're being judgmental, just question after question after question after question. There's an old saying that he or she who asks the questions controls the conversation. And you don't want your client to feel like you're controlling them. So inviting them to tell their story versus asking them a lot of questions is a much better way to help them not feel like they're being controlled or manipulated in some way. Okay, let's next move to summarizing skills. Summarizing skills are when you summarize a statement and then you pull together the facts of that statement, the stressor, the definition of the stressor, the appraisal of the stressor, and feelings associated with that to discuss with the clients. So you want to use summarizing questions that kind of summarize what was said when you end a session, for example, because you want to summarize the whole point of the session, what happened during the session. You could also summarize when you're moving from one part of the interview to the next part of the interview. So you summarize what was said and then you move on. You could summarize with a client that you've seen before and they're coming again. So you'd say, last session we talked about, and then you would summarize what happened in the last session. And then you can stop and summarize when you feel stuck or confused. So it's a way of kind of summarizing what's been said in order to help the client push past where they're stuck. And it buys you a little bit of time to think. So you stop, you summarize, and then you ask, is that about right? That gives a client time to kind of collect their thoughts and to push forward a little bit. Summarizing, therefore, to end the session to begin a session with a previous client, to move from one part of a session to the next, and then when you're a little bit confused. Summarizing is a good tactic to be able to use. Okay, now let's move on to the practices of formal crisis management, which comes next. So we've given you these basic techniques. Now we want to move on. So formal crisis management seeks to prevent a negative outcome from a crisis. In other words, you don't want this person to start using drugs. You don't want them to kill somebody, hurt somebody. You don't want them to hurt themselves, right? It also is used to shorten the duration of a crisis. Crises can go on for long times. And if you can shorten that by giving them skills to cope, both with this crisis and with the next one that comes, you will also have prevented future crises. Now, in formal crisis management, there's some overlapping steps. These are assessment, creating a plan, intervening, and following up. And these can apply, these kind of phases can apply to all kinds of crises, to hazardous events, to precipitating factors that brought on the crisis, to the crisis origins, and to various kinds of crises. So you wanted to really gather and understand, gather information and understand these phases so that you can use this when you deal with traumatized families. Also, as social workers, remember we intervene with individuals, families, groups, and communities. You can use formal crisis management in each of these. You can use formal crisis management to help a person cope with a crisis individually. You could sit with the family and help them sort through something. You might encounter a group, such as a classroom of people that experienced a gunman or experienced somebody having a heart attack in the class, right? Or it could be an entire community, such as the school I mentioned where the pastor had been abusing the kids, or where the tornado ripped through this Plainfield, Illinois. It was just a rapid thing that overturned people's lives in a short period of time, much like what we've been through with Ida and Katrina and other hurricanes. So you can do formal crisis management with communities as well. Next slide, please. So when we think about formal crisis management, we probably want to begin with the concept of assessment. There's two levels of assessment. The first level, level 1 in formal crisis management, is assessing the risk and the threat to one's self, suicidal thinking, and possible threat to others, such as assault or homicide. And then level 2 assessment is assessing the client's, and by client I mean individual, family, group, or community, assessing the client's ability to function in normal roles. Now notice that level 1 is danger. You want to make sure that there's no danger. Then you can move on to thinking about client functioning. So let's explore these a little bit more in depth in the next few slides. Level 1 assessment. You want to do a suicide risk assessment. Now, suicide risk assessment is really, really important. When somebody's experienced a horrible trauma, a major loss, some major crisis, one of the answers that they may have come up with is life is no longer worth living. And so you want to be able to answer the question, what is the likelihood that my client or clients might kill themselves or might solve the problem by death via suicide? Frankly, most people have transitory thoughts about suicide from time to time. Wouldn't life be better if I weren't here? Or wouldn't my problems be solved if I no longer had to live, right? And so many people have passing, transient thoughts about suicide. Some people act on those thoughts, but live. And then a handful of people commit an act that is more lethal and assures death, or they were hoping to be rescued, but the person they thought was going to rescue them didn't show up. So, for example, a husband who's had a major financial setback and feels like his world has fallen apart might drive his car to the garage and sit there and think, I'd just be better off dead and just shut the garage door and leave the car running. But all the while thinking, my wife's going to come home in a few minutes and she's going to find me and we'll talk through this and I'll be okay. But maybe I'll die in the process. And he hopes to be rescued. But the wife then stopped off for groceries. And the carbon monoxide fumes got to him. And so instead of coming home and rescuing him, she comes home and finds him dead. So you want to be able to assess the danger or the potential of death by suicide. Suicide, frankly, for many people in crisis, is an attempt to cope with crisis when they lack other skills. If we can just keep them alive a little bit longer and give them some other skills, we can prevent suicide. Next slide. A couple things that you want to think about when you're assessing for suicide. One is that when a person has a specific plan, which means they've really thought through it, they've got an available method, they have a gun, or they have a bunch of pills stockpiled. When that method is lethal, such as, many people cut on themselves, but they don't intend to kill themselves. But some people decide to cut along the vein and then stick their hand, get in the bathtub, right, to assure that they die. So when a person has a plan that involves a lethal method, that's major cause for concern. Second, if a person has a history of lethal suicide attempts with accidental rescue, and somebody did show up and rescue them, but they chose a lethal method, so they're going to shoot themselves, but somebody came in at the last minute and grabbed the gun out of their hand, right? Or when they took a lot of pills, but somebody found them unresponsive, rushed them to the hospital, pumped their stomach, and saved their lives. So those kind of lethal methods in the past, and by the way, it might not just be this person, but their parent, spouse, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, cousin may have committed suicide by some lethal means. They observed it and figured, maybe this is a way out for me too. Third, when they have very limited or non-existent resources, no hope, or the perception that they don't have resources. Remember, a lot of people have resources, but they've withdrawn in the midst of crisis and are not using those resources well, and we can connect them to resources. And then a fourth risk factor for suicide is when a person doesn't have the ability to communicate effectively and can't talk about their pain they're feeling. The only escape from the pain that they're feeling, the only escape from their situation, because they can't ask for help, they can't talk about it, they don't know how to talk about it, is death. Okay, moving on. So areas to explore. You want to think about their suicidal ideas. Are they, we call this suicidal ideation. Have they thought about suicide? A lot of people are afraid to ask that question. But frankly, most people have thought about suicide, and unless we ask it, we'll never know. People are afraid to ask because they're afraid that they're planting the idea of suicide in somebody's head. Believe me, if somebody's going through stress, trauma, crisis, deep personal, familial pain, they've thought about suicide. So you want to ask about it. The second thing is you want to ask about the lethality of methods. And here in table 11-13, we have some lethal methods. On the left, we have antidepressants such as Elavil, acetaminophen. Tylenol will kill you if you take it in high enough doses. It will cause your liver to stop functioning. Aspirin in high doses, barbiturates. People have car crashes. I had a friend who drove his car off a bridge. Carbon monoxide poisoning is, driving into the garage and shutting off all the doors and letting the fumes build up. Drowning, exposure to extreme cold, a gun, obviously, especially in a place like New Orleans where there's lots of guns running around the streets, hanging, jumping off a tall place, sleeping pills. Often they're prescribed sleeping pills that the person has on hand. Now there's less lethal methods as well, such as non-prescription drugs, tranquilizers, risk cutting, that are less lethal but still need to be taken into account. Third, are those means available? The person says, well, if I was going to kill myself, I'd shoot myself. Do you have a gun? No. So are the means available? And then fourth, the specificity of the plan. If the person can say, you know, I've thought about this. When my wife is gone at work, I can actually leave work for lunch. She doesn't come home for lunch. I could do it at 12 o'clock. Friday would be the best day because business is, you know, people go home early on Fridays and I wouldn't be missed. You know, my kids are going to be at Disney World with their aunt and uncle, and so they won't come in and find me. And so Friday at noon, and I have the gun in the bedside table, I could go out into the back in the garage and shoot myself so it wouldn't, you know, mess up the bed. My wife wouldn't have to clean up too much brain matter. I mean, if the person can talk in that kind of detail about it, right, then you've got a specific plan. Now, 3 and 4 are kind of getting at the odds of a person being rescued. Do they have the means? If they don't have the means, then they could probably be rescued. In specificity of the plan, if they don't have a specific plan, then they might be rescued. So you want to think about their ideation. Are they having ideas of suicide? But remember, lots of people do, and that doesn't mean that just because they have an idea doesn't mean they'll do it. Lethality of method. If they have a really lethal method, your spidey sense should tingle, right? You should be aware. Do they have an available means of doing it? And then fourth, do they have a specific plan? Next slide. Now, we also need to talk about assault and homicide risk, because those kinds of things are also possible outcomes of crisis. So we want to answer the question, what is the likelihood of an assault or a homicide taking place? Imagine a father who found out that an uncle molested his daughter. Major crisis. Now, one way that the father could solve this is going over to the uncle's house and shooting, right? Another example. My husband's having an affair. I could go over to the wife's house and burn her house down, or scratch her car. You see what I'm saying? You know, in some way assault this other person, you know, beat her up. So you want to answer the question, what is the likelihood of this happening? And here's some areas that you want to think about as you address this. Do they have a past history of homicidal threats and or assault? Do they have a current plan to hurt somebody else? Do they possess a lethal weapon, a dangerous knife, a gun, whatever, you know, brass knuckles, whatever? Do they use substances? Because when a person is high or drunk, they're much less likely to make a good decision, more likely to make a bad decision. And is there a lot of conflict in their social relationships, especially their significant social relationships? If there's a lot of conflict, then this person is conflict prone and might engage in some kind of assault or homicide. So you want to think through these things as you're kind of assessing this primary level or level 1 assessment. Next slide. Now, first, the person is found to be at risk for homicide or suicide, then you want to do something, and you want to do it immediately. You want to save their life. Now, if a person says to me, wait a second, I thought whatever was said in this session is confidential, I would say yes, but you mean more to me than my confidentiality with you. I want to keep you alive. Or if it's an assault or homicide threat that you're addressing, you could say the law requires that when I hear about a credible homicide or assault threat, that I need to warn the other person and call the police. So if a person is at risk for homicide, assault, or suicide, then you want to intervene right then and right there. We'll talk more about how to do this in future slides. If they're not at risk for the above, then you can move to the level 2 of the assessment process. So let's move there now. Level 2 assessment determines whether the client is in a vulnerable state or in a crisis. If the client's vulnerable but not yet in crisis, you do primary prevention, right? You want to prevent the crisis from occurring. If the client is in crisis, then it's time to do crisis intervention. Now, in the next few slides, we're going to start talking about what crisis intervention is all about. So let's move on. Level 2 assessment identifies the following. What happened? The hazardous event. What happened next after the hazardous event? What was a precipitating factor that brought you here for help? Now look, people have problems. Everybody has problems. Some people go for help. Why do you go for help? Because something precipitated this cry for help. Something got bad enough that now they're asking somebody to help them. Number 3, what is the origin of the stressor? Is it something coming from outside? Is it somebody threatening them? Or is it something coming from inside, right? Something coming from inside the family, inside the individual. Is it situational? The situation's causing it. Is it socio-cultural? Something in our world that's causing it. Or is it transitional? People are moving from one level to the next. A major crisis can be precipitated by the breakup of a significant relationship, right? That would be a transition from being with somebody to now being single again. And many people have crises when relationships break up, especially when the relationship's been going on for a long time. So imagine living with somebody for 5-6 years and really investing time and energy, intermingling your funds, buying a house together, going to church together, having friends in common, and then all of a sudden a breakup. That causes you to really wonder what's wrong with you. So that would be a transitional problem. Or when a parent dies, right? Or when a spouse dies. Those are all major life transitions that can precipitate crisis. So you want to define the stressor. Is it a threat? Is it a loss? Or is it a challenge to be overcome? You want to think about 5, the vulnerability that the person has or the manifestation of the crisis, how they feel about the event, their appraisal of the event. You want to think about resources. What do they have available? And what are they using? What's currently being used? What's available but not being used? You want to think about coping strategies, both negative and positive. Negative strategies, you don't want them to continue. So if they're using heroin to cope with their, homelessness, that's probably negative, right? I mean, in some ways it could be positive because it's anesthetizing the pain, but frankly, a heroin addiction is a horrible thing that further wrecks the person's life. But they also have some positive coping strategies. So things like, skills, work skills that they have, or things that they've done in the past that have worked, like ways of thinking or ways of acting, that you want to build on those. So it's good to know about those because you can add those to the repertoire or bring them back into use. And then you want to think about the contexts. Remember the external and internal contexts. Is this stressor caused by something outside of the person's control, or is this stressor caused by something within the person's control? Those make a difference. And so let's move a little bit deeper into this by talking about developing a crisis plan. Next slide. So plan, as we know from our direct service class, right, needs to be developed with the client, needs to be appropriate to the client's functional level and dependency needs to be problem-oriented. Now, I added on my own here solution-oriented because I like to think more about solutions than problems. I think whatever we focus on, we get more of. And so I want to think not just about problem-oriented, but I want to think about solution-oriented. So the person has a problem, but we want to propose solutions. You want to have a plan that's consistent with their lifestyle, consistent with their culture. You want to be inclusive of the client's social network, drawing those social resources in. Plan needs to be realistic, because if it's not realistic or doable, then it's pointless. It needs to be time limited, so that the person knows that this can be accomplished in a certain amount of time, and that gives them hope. It's just an extended amorphous plan with no time limit, and the person feels like, oh my gosh, this crisis is going to go on for the rest of my life. It needs to be concrete. There needs to be specific, doable, measurable, actionable things that can be done, right? It needs to be negotiable and renegotiable. In other words, if the client says to you, that's not going to work for me, then you need to take that into account, right? You need to have a negotiation process with them. And, frankly, if you call them up and it's not working, you need to be able to renegotiate the plan. And then it needs to include an element of follow-up. In other words, it's not a one and done, but you want to have, as built into the plan, a process of checking back in with the client. So let's go a little bit deeper into each of these for the next few slides. When we say a plan must be developed with the client, it means that we're doing with the client rather than doing for the client. Never do for a client what a client is capable of doing for themselves. You want to empower the client rather than further, because they already feel disempowered, right? Feel like they have no power, their world is falling apart. You don't want to disempower them by doing things for them. You want to empower them by showing them that they can do this themselves, that they can draw on their own resources and the resources of their world to solve this problem and move through past this crisis. If you do for them, then they feel helpless and dependent. So never do for a client what they can do for themselves. It also must be appropriate to the client's functional level and dependency needs. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, frankly, a client is sometimes able to function at, in the midst of crisis at, say, 75% capacity. And others can only operate at 25% capacity. And so you really want to think about where they are functionally. You also want to think about their dependency needs. Very dependent people really want others to do for them. They don't want to do for themselves. And so they will go from church to church to church asking for money rather than getting a job. We have to be very, or they will come to you and say, I don't know how to do that. Can you do it for me? Can you make that call for me? Can you help me with this? Can you fill out that application for me? So very dependent people are kind of accustomed to getting other people to do for them. We don't want to do for clients what they're capable of doing for themselves. They can make a phone call, right? Now, the other extreme is very independent people. Independent people who are, who've grown accustomed to doing things by themselves. Those people are less likely to accept help. So we need to maybe help them a little bit so they can once again return to independence. But they may need a time of being helped by somebody else in the interim. Independent people don't like to ask for help. And so some people maybe need a little more help, right? Because they're just stuck. So you want to kind of think about how dependent they are and how functional they are at this point in order to assess how much help you need to give them and how much of it you need to do for them. But remember, the rule of thumb is always never do for a client what they're capable of doing for themselves. A solution or a plan should be solution-oriented or problem-oriented at least. You need to focus on the client's perception of the problem, what's going on with them. You need to think about what was the hazardous event that led them to where they are today. You need to focus on crisis issues because you can deal with the non-crisis issues later in the follow-up phase. But really, in the crisis management plan, you need to deal with issues directly related to the crisis. Now, a client may bring up, say, marital or family problems, right? You can address these later in marriage or family counseling. Right now, you just need to focus on the immediate crisis and getting past it. A plan needs to be consistent with the client's culture and lifestyle. In other words, clients are more likely to follow a plan that meets their traditions, that kind of goes with who they are. So, well, I'm just trying to think about some potential cultural traditions, but relying on family or not relying on family, depending on their culture. Trusting the police versus not trusting the police. Involving the church versus not involving the church. All those things you'd want to think about. And then, of course, you'd want to think about their background, right? So are they from Latin America? Are they Native American? Are they Asian, Vietnamese, right? And so you'd want to think about in their culture how help is asked for and utilized. We also want to think about social networks, because plans that involve a client's social network are more likely to be successful because they can go on across time. And so we want to involve the social network as much as possible. Social networks, when we talk about that, we mean resources that the clients can draw upon in times of crisis, like intimate attachments, such as lovers, spouses, siblings, friends, parents, children. But we also want to think about community affiliations, school, church, the medical community, clubs, their work, neighbors. I have a friend who is hard of hearing and is very feeble, but doesn't want to go to a nursing home, and he's from Switzerland, has nobody else in his family living here because they're all living back in Switzerland. And he frankly could not live on his own except for his next door neighbor really cares about him and kind of looks out for him, drives him to hospital appointments, drives him to his Rotary Club meetings, checks in to make sure he's following up on his medical care, make sure he's eating, make sure his house is taken care of, right? So without this friend, this guy would have to go to a nursing home. That's how community affiliations can be helpful. So part of our planning needs to be these kind of elements, right? Next slide. We also need to think about being realistic. I mean, we could come up with a plan that involves $1 million, right? Or a plan that involves, becoming an Olympic athlete, but those are not realistic for most people. So we need to be realistic about their needs and realistic about the resources that are available to meet those needs. Plans need to be time limited and concrete. And by that, we mean plans can't just go on and on forever because the person will lose hope. The window for opportunity for change is relatively limited. And so we take advantage of this crisis to help this family change. Concrete plans also allow clients to know exactly what they should be doing and when. The more we can make a plan measurable, concrete, attainable, right, and write it down so they know what to do, the more likelihood there is that they will follow through. Otherwise, they'll see the plan as undoable. Now, plans must also be negotiable, renegotiable, and have an element of follow-up. You see, plans need to have the possibility of change built into them, baked right in. Because if what we prescribed or the plan that we came up with didn't work, then you need to have the possibility of doing something else. It can't be a rigid plan. This is my way or the highway, the only way. So you've got to be able to negotiate and renegotiate the plan with the client to help them along the way. There also needs to be a follow-up plan because you need to be able to check in with them after you come up with this plan to be sure that they implement it. You also need to define when and where that follow-up is going to take place. If you have an office, great, in your office. But the follow-up could also take place at a coffee house or in a restaurant or in the person's home, some place in the community. But you need to build into the plan this where and when of follow-up. They need to know that somebody's going to check in with them, A, for accountability, but B, because they want to know that they're not alone in this crisis, that somebody's going to be following them through the crisis and making sure they're okay. So you want to check in to see how the plan is progressing and whether it's working as planned. And then, if it's not, then to Do it differently in the future. Come up with some other ideas, right? And come up with a new plan. Okay, so now you've met with the person and you've got a plan. You need to put that plan in writing. Remember, this person is going through some pretty stressful stuff. They're in the midst of a crisis and they are not going to remember as well as they should. Having the plan in writing will help them remember what they are to do. This plan is also known as the Crisis Management Contract. Sound familiar? Just like the contracting that we did in Direct Service 1, right? There will be some intervention. That intervention can be done during assessment because you don't want to just assess and then leave the client hanging. So you may do some interventions early. You can also do interventions during planning, or you can implement an intervention after the assessment and the planning are done, because the assessment and the plan may actually begin the recovery process. So there may be no need for further intervention. On the other hand, you want to have some intervention skills in your back pocket because you're going to need to use some of them with the client down the road, possibly. So we're going to now move into talking about these interventions. And this is a really interesting part of this lecture. So I want you to pay close attention and take some notes because you're going to need to remember this down the road. You will be using these interventions. We're going to cover some general intervention strategies. And they apply to a lot of situations, but if you really want to know more and to really get involved as a crisis manager or doing formal crisis management, you might want some more training. And so I've given you some ideas here of some other training possibilities. There's always the route of CEUs where you can do some continuing education credits after the class. There's some crisis counseling certificates that you can earn to go alongside your degree and become part of your overall portfolio. And then there is the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation that has a bunch of trainings that you can do as well. So we're not going to train you in formal crisis management, but rather we're going to talk in the next few slides about strategies that you can use when you are encountering somebody who's suicidal, homicidal, threatening, somebody who's undergone loss, and we're specifically going to cover some interventions with children from young to adolescent. So let's delve in. So interventions for suicide risk. For those who are at low risk, now you've done a suicide assessment, people who are at low risk, low lethality, no plan, transient thoughts, but not really fleshed out. People at low risk for suicide, you can educate them about suicide, you can empower them, you can connect them to resources, and you can do a no suicide contract. And that doesn't have to be formal. It can just be an informal agreement, let's agree here and now that while we're working through this, you will not commit suicide, you will not attempt suicide or attempt self-harm until we've exhausted some other methods, because I think we can get through this without you harming yourself. In fact, I know we can get through this. I have hope because I've been there with other clients, I've been there myself. I know we can get through this. So that's an informal suicide contract, just kind of a verbal suicide contract. For those with medium risk for suicide, now you're getting concerned. Maybe they've tried it in the past, now they're thinking about trying it again, or maybe they've begun stockpiling pills and kind of thinking about a plan. You may want to consider a more formal written suicide contract. If you're really concerned, you may want to put them on a suicide watch, having family members involved that are kind of watching over them to make sure that they're not going to commit suicide, having, involving their school or their work or their family, whoever else that can be there with them kind of 24/7 until this passes. You can have the client bring you their planned means of suicide, bring you their gun, bring you their pills. You can also address their ambivalence. Remember that people want to live as much as they want to die. typically our desire to live is higher than our desire to death. Freud called this the desire to live, the eros, and the desire to die, the thanatos. He said those exist in tension between most people, but the eros, the desire to live, typically is higher than the desire to die. But in crisis, that polarity, especially with medium risk, may be equal. Now, those at high risk really want to die more than they want to live. Those are the ones we need to be super concerned about. So you'd want to think about that ambivalence, right? And then appeal, if they're equal, you'd want to appeal to the right to live, the reasons that they have to live. But also to recognize that those two forces are in flux in their life, and you understand the challenge, and so you want to address that with them. And you might want to consider hospitalization. A week in the hospital might be very helpful to, buy them time to clear their thoughts and to have their desire to live pass up their desire to die. Now, for those at high risk for suicide, if they get a plan, it's going to happen tonight, tomorrow, and it's going to happen, they've been very clear about it, then you want to call the police, call an ambulance. You want to get them in the hospital right away. No negotiating. If you're in doubt about what to do, contact a colleague. And whenever I'm confused, I contact my colleagues who have more perspective than I do because they're not involved with the client. Or you can contact your supervisor and talk through it a little bit. Here's an example of a suicide contract. This is a specific written contract. I, fill in their name, agree that I will not kill myself or in other way harm myself, either accidentally or on purpose, until I have seen and talked with you or their counselor, their therapist, or social worker, on blank specific date in their office. I will not accidentally or on purpose take an overdose of medication. I will drive my car safely and pay attention anytime I'm behind the wheel. Signed by the person, witnessed by you, and then a date. Oddly enough, it's been shown time and time again that a written suicide contract can keep somebody from killing themselves. Remember, part of them wants to live. Just that the part of them that wants to live when they're truly suicidal is smaller, lower than their desire to live. But there's still a part of them in there that wants to live. And so they are appreciative of you kind of keeping them alive for another day or two or up to a week. And a suicide contract can be effective for up to about a week, but then it ceases to have effectiveness anymore. So there's got to be some intervention before that time period elapses. Next slide, please. Now we're going to turn to assault or homicide risk. It's very important that you understand the implications of the lawsuit Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California. This is also known as Tarasoff. And we are, as clinicians, as social workers, we are required to give what's called the Tarasoff warning. If a person gives you a credible threat that they intend to harm somebody else or kill somebody else, then you have a legal obligation to inform that potential victim and the police to prevent that from happening. Up until Tarasoff, it was believed that whatever happened in the room with the client was sacrosanct. You could not break confidentiality. However, in this particular case, a client then went out and followed through on the threat and did it. They sued the school counselor at the University of California, and they won. This is known as Tarasoff versus the University of California, which means that from that point forward, anytime there's a credible threat that somebody is going to harm or kill someone else, we are required to both warn them and call the police. Now, here's some things that you want to think about if you're dealing with somebody that is a threat. You want to remove yourself from a dangerous situation if necessary. If you're in danger, get out of the room. It's always a good practice to make sure that the client is not, especially clients you don't know, that the client is not seated between you and the door. You want to have, your ability to exit the room quickly, unimpeded. Because if the person that goes off and you're in the room and they're between you and the door, you have no escape. So whenever you do work with clients, you want to make sure that you're closer to the door than they are. Second, you want to use strategies as you assess this assault, or the potential assault, or this potential homicide. You want to use strategies similar to that you use for suicide risk. Is there a plan? What is the lethality of method, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For most people, they feel very angry, as if they could kill this other person, but within a day or two, that goes away, at least a week, right? So the danger passes if you can just keep them from acting out on their desires or their thoughts or their threats for a few days. It usually will go away. Remember that the goal of saving lives is more important. It supersedes confidentiality. Confidentiality is important. It is a very high ethical standard of social work. But keeping somebody alive supersedes that. When the risk abates, when it goes away, maybe they still want to kill the other person, but they're not actively thinking about it all the time, then you can start relying on general intervention strategies to assist them. Next slide. As we delve into intervention strategies, and we'll get more specific in further slides, but I want to give you some general intervention strategies that Weber has highlighted in the book. And you'll recognize many of these from previous classes. You want to listen actively. Remember, active listening is listening with more than your ears. You don't just want to hear their words, but you want to see them. You want to look at their body language. You want to lean forward. You want to totally engage all of your senses in understanding what they're telling you, both verbally, but also non-verbally. That's active listening. So you want to listen actively and with concern. You want to encourage them to express their emotions, to come out with their feelings, and to not be ashamed of their feelings. You want to help them gain an understanding of the crisis. You want to help them accept the new reality of their life. None of us will ever be the same after the tragedies in our life. Doesn't mean that life is forever ruined by that tragedy. It just means that we're going to move ahead as a different person. So accepting the new reality of life. Helping them explore ways of coping with the problems. Giving them some new techniques or exploring new techniques with them, things that they may not have in their repertoire yet, but you know about that could be helpful to them. You want to link them to their social network. In crisis, often people withdraw from their social network at a time when they need them the most. You want to reinforce newly learned coping strategies, helping them to practice them, helping them to feel confident about them. And when coping strategies occasionally fail and they say, yeah, it doesn't work, you want to say, wait a second, you haven't tried long enough, you can do this. So reinforcing those coping strategies. And then finally, you want to follow up. So a formal crisis plan may be only one session. If it's only one session, you don't know how they did. They want to know that you're going to be there more than just one session. So you have to have a plan for follow-up that involves place and time. Okay, let's delve a little bit more into more specific strategies, starting with some interventions when people experience loss. Younger kids, those that are preschoolers, lack verbal skills to process through things verbally. So you're probably not going to do much talk therapy or talk intervention with children in crisis. Also, preschoolers are very vulnerable to the reactions of adults in their lives. they're sensing that something's really wrong in the family, and they're afraid that their family's going to leave them. They're afraid that their world's going to change dramatically, and they're afraid that they're not going to be taken care of. And so we need to reassure them that somebody will take care of them. And then we need to help them access their feelings and thoughts in ways that are less verbal. Our goal with preschoolers is to help them integrate the experience into themselves, so to help them understand the experience and kind of come to grips with it, and then reestablish a sense of security. And of course, we want to help them master their emotions and master their fears. And we can do this through some alternative means. Number one, we can encourage them to express themselves through play. We can encourage the family and those in their world to provide verbal reassurance and physical comforting. They need to be held and touched and rocked, the things that parents do. We need to encourage those in their world to give them frequent attention. They're terrified that any lack of attention means abandonment, and so parents need to recognize that, and people in their world need to recognize that. Grandparents, neighbors, teachers, those in their world. Preschool, right? Daycare providers. We need to encourage them to express their feelings and concerns, to cry, to when they're angry, to talk about their anger, right? One of the great things we can do with kids is to provide comforting bedtime routines, because when the parent leaves the room at night, the feelings of abandonment erupt. And so they need a story and a song and a back scratch or a head scratch or a tucking in, right? All those little routines at bedtime that comfort children. And it could be possible that their anxiety, because it's worse when the lights are out and they're alone at nighttime, their anxiety may require a time of sleeping in the same room with the parents, like a little pallet on the floor, until they kind of get their feelings together and feel, like they're in mastery again. They can master their emotions. You don't want to encourage them to sleep there all the time, every night. You don't want to encourage them for the rest of their lives to be in the same room with you for obvious reasons, right? But you might need to give them the space to occasionally, or even for a period of time, a month, to sleep in the same room until the crisis is kind of resolved. Let's move on then. Let's talk about early childhood. For early childhood, kids that are a little bit older, maybe in elementary school, fear of loss is very difficult. And often children will regress to an earlier stage of life. By that I mean things like, wetting themselves or sucking their thumbs or acting in childlike ways that, parents and those around them thought they had outgrown already. So recognizing that regression is common, we would need to be very patient and tolerant with kids of this age in crisis. Again, play sessions might be helpful ways to facilitate some talk about emotions. Keep in mind that these kids have a little bit more language skills, and so they're able to talk a little bit, but play is a great facilitator of that kind of talk. We need to discuss with adults and peers the frightening, anxiety-provoking events, and together explore appropriate behaviors they might use to address those. School might temporarily consider lessening their expectations. That might be true at home as well. Chores or behavioral expectations might be loosened up a little bit for a time, at least, as this kid adjusts to their new reality. Another thing would be providing structure. When the world feels chaotic, kids want structure in their life. They want routine. So you might consider implementing some chores or implementing some responsibilities or giving them something to do, or putting boundaries around them in some way that helps them feel like they're back in control. or if they're not in control internally, that the world around them will help keep them in control. And then as much as possible, kids in crisis need a routine. They need to know what happens when, and then to return to that routine as soon as possible. So now let's move on to talk about pre-adolescence. Pre-ads need to know that peers share their reactions. Remember, they're really conscious at this age of their peers and being part of the group, right? And so we want their peers to be understanding. Frankly, we may need to create a group of peers that have been through similar experiences that could understand them. In this group, we want to lessen tension, we want to decrease their anxiety, and we want to alleviate any possible guilt feelings they have. Now, remember that kids can take on guilt that doesn't really belong to them, a kind of false guilt, feeling as if they somehow created the crisis. If only I had been a better little boy, my parents would not have gotten divorced. If only I hadn't left that door open, my grandfather would have caught that cold and died, right? And so there's kind of false guilt, and we need to help them get through that. So here's some things that we can do with pre-ads. Whenever possible, provide group activities. And those group activities need to be geared towards the resumption of normal routines. I don't know, hanging out with their friends, going to parties, playing on a sports team, being involved in ballet or I don't know, making pots, whatever the kid was doing before that involved groups and routines. We need to help them. Number two, we need to involve them in same age group activities, because now they're feeling like they're weird and different than everybody else, and they need to be normalized as much as possible. If possible, it'd be great to have them involved in group discussions that examine feelings about the crisis and that explore appropriate behaviors for stress management at this level. They need structured but undemanding responsibilities at home and school. But at the same time, they may need some of the expectations of them tempered a little bit as they go through this crisis. There needs to be some understanding that they're not going to function as they did previously. And then for these kids, there needs to be individualized attention and consideration given to them. Teacher, school counselor, school social worker, parent, coach, uncle, aunt, grandparent may need to make a big effort to spend time with them. So let's move into adolescence. Now, adolescents are strongly oriented towards peers. Remember your Erik Erikson, who said that this is the stage of identity formation. If they don't have peers, then they have trouble negotiating their leaving home and becoming part of the world. All of adolescence is a process of gradually reorienting oneself towards the world at large, and less with one's nuclear family. Now, adolescents are very, very distressed when their peer activities are disrupted, and they are very distressed when they are treated like a child and not allowed to participate in adult activities. So they really want to be more adult-like and moved in that direction. So you might involve them in the community and get them to take on community responsibilities, things like letter writing, right, or speaking out or going to rallies, those kinds of things. Giving them a chance to in some way substantively respond. You might encourage them to share what's going on with them, their feelings, their concerns, information with their peers and others outside of the family. Especially when the family's been compromised by the crisis, they need to rely on outside supports. But that deep sense of shame, because they don't want to be rejected, right? They want to be accepted by their peers, so that there may be a sense of shame that keeps them from sharing, and that sense of shame keeps them from getting the help they need, when actually their peers might, upon hearing their story, say, oh wow, what can we do to help? And so you want to encourage them to talk about their feelings. As with the others, you may want to temporarily reduce expectations at school a little bit, and in general, if needed, to kind of help them, give them time to rebalance themselves. And you may encourage, but don't insist upon, discussion of their fears within the family setting. Adolescents need a little bit more rope, a little bit more freedom to kind of do things their own way. And so we want to be very, very careful not to push them to do things that they shouldn't, that they don't want to do. We may encourage them to do things they don't want to do, and thus help them move on. But remember, the key to dealing with adolescents is dealing with their need to be part of the peer group. Okay, let's talk for a minute about follow-up, starting with the next slide. The main purpose of follow-up is to check the progress towards the goals and completion of the plan that you've established, the crisis management plan. Now, follow-up might include long-term counseling or longer-term counseling or therapy. And by long-term, I don't mean 6 years or a year. I might mean 10 sessions, but that's something that formal crisis management doesn't do. That then moves from crisis management to kind of tertiary management or psychotherapy. Follow-up plans are made when you're developing the service plan. They need to be baked right into the service plan. So you're going to need some identifying information, address, phone number, email, those kinds of things, so that you can contact them for follow-up. It may be that you agree, as you develop the plan for follow-up, to the crisis management plan, that you've already established a time a week later, a month later, sometime later, to actually follow up. And so you've already written that down, but you would want to call them or email them to be sure they're going to be there. Sometimes, in certain kinds of trauma and crisis, such as an abusive home situation, it may not be appropriate to call to the house. You don't want the abusive spouse picking up the phone and using that as a precipitant for further abuse. And so clients may need to initiate the follow-up at their own convenience and with an eye towards their own safety. During follow-up, you want to really explore the crisis intervention plan and to see how they did with the plan, and to get their feedback on the plan, and to get the feedback on how they're doing, right? If the plan didn't work, you need to know that. If the plan did work, you need to know that. If the plan didn't work, you probably want to start the process over, going back and doing some reassessment and thinking through what you might have missed the first go-round. Or you may just choose to rethink or redo some of the steps. In other words, some of the interventions, the things they need to do, you may need to think about some new things that they could do that you may have missed the first time, or that aren't working, and substitute things that might work instead. So you'd want to go back and kind of rework the plan a little bit. But there's got to be follow-up. If there's not follow-up, and the person feels like, well, what's the thing all about? I mean, so I need to know that this person cares about me enough to check back in with me. And so you want to build that in and then follow through and do it. You do want to follow through with each of your clients who are going through crisis. Well, told you that would be a long chapter. However, we're done. This is my last lecture for Social Work 422, Families in Stress. I do want to thank you for taking my class. I am honored that you would learn from me and allow me the opportunity to teach you. I've enjoyed and benefited from your feedback, your work in the class, your words, your discussion boards. I have liked talking to those of you who have taken the time to contact me or email me. I appreciate you. And so I'm glad that we got to work together, and I'm proud of you. I hope that this has been beneficial to you. I know a couple of you have contacted me and let me know that this kind of has paralleled something going on in your own life, and it's been perfect and timely. But I hope that you're now better equipped to handle families in crisis and to think through those kinds of things. And I hope that some of you maybe pursue a career in formal crisis management. Remember that just because the class is over doesn't mean that our relationship is over. I'm still here for you if you need me. And also that my words are now deeply implanted in your subconscious and go with you wherever you go. And I hope that's a beneficial thing to you. I hope that my words and anything that I've said that's been beneficial will go with you and become part of your professional development. In short, thank you. I'm proud of you. And I hope this has been really helpful. Now, a couple last items to be aware of. The research paper is coming due. Pay attention to the due date and make sure that you submit it. The final exam is coming up. Now I'm going to give you a window of opportunity in which to take it. It's not just all at one sitting. Well, you need to take it all in one sitting, but we're not going to sit down in some kind of classroom or some kind of real-time space and all do it in the same 2 hours. You only have 2 hours to take this exam, and you have to take it by the time the exam closes at 11:59 on the closing date, 11:59 p.m. on the closing date. So pay attention to the dates. But it will open up and you'll have a week in which to take this exam. You're going to need 2 uninterrupted hours. Once the exam opens, the clock starts ticking. Once you close it, it's over. You can't open it up again and start up again. So you need to be prepared in advance for this exam by studying the questions that we've already done and by studying the study guide that I've provided for you under final exam. Remember, 2 hours to take the exam. Once it opens, you cannot close it until you're done. And once that 2 hours is up, the exam closes. So study in advance. Don't try to go to the book and look everything up. It's not going to work, and you won't have time. But it'll be mostly the questions you've encountered before with a little twist thrown in to give those of you who need or who appreciate, whose learning style, I should say, is more narrative in nature. You have a chance to kind of write out some things in a long essay question that will count for a lot of points. All right, all that to say, peace be with you. May my words go with you. May this class really become part of your professional development. Thank you, and goodbye.